Well, good evening. Thanks to everyone for joining our Zoom tonight. I'm State Representative Rena Moran, representing the Rondo and Falltown communities of St. Paul. You know, this is a critical moment for our democracy, and we greatly appreciate having all of you here tonight. Just a few months ago, supporters of the former president launched an attack on our Capitol with the purpose of overturning the election result and overthrowing democracy. Their attackers were seconds behind the fleeing Congress members. While the Capitol Police were able to fend them off, this anti-democratic movement did not go away. Just last week, Homeland Security warned that we face increased threat from domestic terrorists as COVID restrictions are eased. So that is why it is so important that we understand the big picture, not just focus on the current crisis. Nancy MacLean research has documented a decade-long plan by the Koch brothers and their vast networks of think tanks to undermine our democracy. The events of the last few years cannot be viewed without looking at the Koch road. I know from my experience in the Minnesota legislature that we often have to deal with bills written by Koch organization Alex, like bills like the right to work legislation, a bill to tax and regulate marijuana like alcohol. There has been bills from abortion to pay sick leave, and I am having a little technical problems right now, so bear with me. I'm sorry about that. There has been bills from abortion to pay sick leave to school choice. To put into perspective the influence of Alex in the Minnesota House of Representatives, read by Republican legislators, from 2011 to 2018, at least 279 bills included language that closely mirrored language influenced by Alex. Our thanks to Nancy MacLean and tonight's speakers, but also to the local groups who organized this event. The Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers is a coalition of peace and justice groups who initiated this event. Our co-sponsors are Common Cause Minnesota, Citizens for Global Solution Minnesota, Clean Election Minnesota, Indivisible MN03, Plymouth Area Indivisible, the Minnesota Peace Project, Minnesota Move to Amend, Spotlight Team, and Women Against Military Madness. Our purpose tonight is to better understand what's happening to our democracy and also to inspire some of you, a lot of you, I hope, to be more involved, to maybe join one of our sponsoring organizations. We're not going to be able to defend democracy without more of us getting involved and playing a role. We can no longer take for granted that our country always has been and always will be a democracy. So we're honored tonight to begin our program with a few remarks from my friend, Attorney General Keith Ellison. You are all aware that the Attorney General recently successfully led the prosecution of the Derek Chauvin trial. We are incredibly proud of the professional and well-coordinated job that his prosecution team carried out. Not as many as you are aware that he made history last year by filing a lawsuit against the Koch Industries for climate change deception, making Minnesota the first state to sue the Koch company. We've asked the Attorney General Ellison to make a few remarks about this lawsuit, and you will hear his remarks now. So let's go to the Ellison video.
In June of 2020, my office filed a lawsuit against ExxonMobil, the American Petroleum Institute, and the Koch brothers industries. The reason we did so is because over the course of decades, these three institutions conspired and worked together to deceive the American public. People knew, scientists knew, that the product that these companies sell was contributing to global climate change and called it out. And yet, in a series of disinformation campaigns, these entities came together to essentially lie about the effect of their product. We can show, and will show in court, that they knew the effect of their product was to impact climate. And we also know that they simultaneously, as they knew it, they had a campaign that said that people who called out climate change were quote unquote chicken littles and were exaggerating the problem, and the problem didn't really exist. In fact, they spent money, time, and resources trying to deceive the public. So we sued them. We sued them because of deceptive advertising, false advertising, making improper and untrue claims to consumers. We sued them, and we expect to get compensation and to get full restitution and to make them fund a campaign to correct the lies that they told. And that's what we're doing. And we intend to pursue this vigorously. But, and it feels to me like they haven't even stopped. Earlier this year, one of their folks that they give monies to, one of their industry allies who they fund, put out a op-ed in the Minneapolis Star Tribune attacking, the fact that we have people on our staff to help us make sure the environmental laws are followed. But this foundation that this author came from gets money from these institutions. And so the bottom line is their misinformation and disinformation hasn't really even stopped. And it's appalling, it's sad, and it's something that we've got to bring to an end. We need honesty, we need forthrightness, and we need justice in this area of fossil fuel production. We can deal with it if they just tell the truth. But when they lie, we can't deal with it. And that just makes this world a little bit more unlivable every day. So we're going to do something about it. And we hope you do something about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Attorney General Ellison, for your explanation of that lawsuit. We are all proud that Minnesota is taking the lead on standing up to these powerful companies. Nancy MacLean work makes it clear that climate change is not only area where the Koch network is constantly deceiving the public. It is not the only area. And believe me, we're seeing many bills in the Minnesota legislature. Our panel tonight is outstanding. We're honored that Nancy MacLean is our guest speaker tonight. She is a nationally acclaimed author and professor of history and public policy at Duke University. Her award-winning book, Democracy and Change, gives us a critically important perspective on what is happening now in the US. Our current crisis in democracy is best understood by looking at the decades-long plans by the radical right. We have to be aware of the Koch network works to change our courts, our elections, our laws, our media. MacLean's brilliant work provides the big picture that is often missing from analysis of today's events. So we are excited to have three Minnesota leaders with us tonight to interview MacLean. Sam Grant is an award-winning professor at Metro State University and the executive director of Minnesota 350. Sam hails from a family that for generations have worked to make both our democracy and economy inclusive, equitable, and open. He has worked organizing around the intersectionality of these issues since his college days, and he continues to do so now at Minnesota 350. Representative Emma Greenman, my colleague, represents the communities of South Minneapolis and Eastern Richfield in the Minnesota House. She is a strong voting rights advocate. She wrote House File 9, the Democracy for the People's Act, to protect and strengthen the right to vote and reduce the influence of dark money in our election. Previously, she worked with Nancy MacLean when she led the Center for Popular Democracy, Voting Rights and Democracy program. And last not least, we have Don Shelby, who is well known to Minnesotans. In his 50-year career as an investigative journalist and TV anchor, he has won numerous national awards. In retirement, he has continued to be very active, lending his time to community organizations and taking part in national and international events on solutions to climate change. We're very appreciative of his role tonight in moderating our conversation with Nancy MacLean. Thank you, Don.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Representative. And it will be coming back to you, Sam, and to you, Emma, in about 20 minutes. But we're going to spend the first 20 minutes just with Professor MacLean to outline the book. And so I don't know if we have a copy. There it is, The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America, Democracy in Chains. A remarkable piece of journalism, ranks up there recently, I would say, with the work of Jane Mayer and Dark Money. And it is just unbelievable what you have unearthed and the expository journalism that you provided. And I'm envious as an investigative reporter that I didn't have a chance to be at your side and unearthing all of the threads that were available at the time. What I would like to do, Professor, first of all, welcome on behalf of MN 350 and thank you for your work in putting this before the public. It's high time that we wake up to the fact that there is a manipulation going on behind the curtain that we don't see. I would like to start this way in a chronological order, because I think, as you pointed out in your book, there is a thread that goes all the way back to John C. Calhoun in pre-Civil War days that was basically propertied in white supremacy and moved forward through time. And we've seen much of the same things reappear. So give me your first statement on the relationship between where we are now and the activities of somebody like the historic figure, John C. Calhoun.
Yes, well, thank you, Don. It is such an honor to be here, being in conversation with you. And I want to thank all the folks who put on tonight's event. Have been really looking forward to it and looking forward to hearing from the representatives and from Sam Grant as well. So great to be with all of you. As for John C. Calhoun, yes, he was a figure that when I went to school back in the day, we thought had been slayed, that those ideas were long gone. This was a man who, when he was in the US Senate, proclaimed on the floor of the US Senate that slavery was a positive good, and who was actually a quite inventive thinker, writing very elaborate tracts reinterpreting the Constitution for arch property rights. The reason he did that is that he understood that the slaveholding class was going to become an increasing minority in an expanding country with democracy prevailing in other parts of the country besides the South. And he wanted to head that off with an interpretation of the Constitution that would make it impossible for democracy to hinge on the most arch capitalists of the day, who were Southern slaveholders, and particularly the cotton planters that he represented in South Carolina. So what I learned in researching Democracy in Chains is that Calhoun's ideas never went away. They established a kind of lineage of thinking about property, liberty as property rights that has gone on to infuse the Koch brothers and their large political network in our day. These are people who value economic liberty above all else, above the well-being of the citizenry, above the operations of democracy, above everything. Economic liberty is their highest virtue. And I was surprised to find when I was doing my research that some of the thinkers behind this that Charles Koch has funded actually appeal to John C. Calhoun and say that their mentors thinking, this man, James Buchanan, whose ideas Charles Koch weaponized, that Buchanan and Calhoun had the same understanding of the Constitution and property rights. So it's not me putting words in their mouths. This is coming from the people who are part of this cause, recognizing their affinity with Calhoun.
James Madison in Federalist 10 wrote about the tyranny of the majority. He was focused primarily on factionalism and not to get into detail on constitutional history, but That's the reason we are a republic and not a pure democracy. That's why we have an electoral college. That's why we have checks and balances and what have you. The concern, it seems to me, is that not only the Koch brothers, but going all the way back to John C. Calhoun through Reconstruction and particularly Jim Crow, that there is a certain portion of the American society, the moneyed, the rich, perhaps even the oligarchical, if allowed to continue, are saying we don't want everyone to vote. Because if they vote, they become the majority and we become the minority. The rich people become the minority. And who knows what will happen then? They may take our money away from us and spend it on people who need it. Isn't that really the point?
That is absolutely the point. And you can hear them then and now saying this again in their own words. Paul Weyrich, who was one of the founders of the modern New Right and the religious right and the American Legislative Exchange Council, said quite frankly that, I believe this was 1981, but he said, we don't want everyone to vote. If everyone votes, we'll have a problem because they'll want to do things that we don't want as this minority of people committed to extreme economic liberty and to the suppression of much of the population. They will vote for things that we don't want. So they are very clear in their thinking, very self-conscious about it, and very determined in pursuing their goals. So I think that's why it's so important we're having this conversation, because I think for too long on the progressive side, there's been a tendency to look at the right and it's anti-science and, conspiracy mongering and such, and imagine that these people aren't shrewd, and it might be that the people that they rely on to vote are not well informed, but the people who are really driving this, as you say, behind the curtain, the extremely wealthy people and the strategists that they hire, they know exactly what they want, and they've been pursuing it in a very determined way. And that's why we're in the plight we're in now, when majorities of the American population agree on issue after issue. They think the wealthy and corporations aren't being, paying their fair share. They think workers deserve collective voice. They think we need to protect the environment. We need to support our public schools, all of these different things and more. And yet we can't break through. And that's because these very shrewd thinkers over a number of years have been systematically rigging the rules. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we go.
Good. And I'm going to just stay in history for just a second, because I think one of the points that is very instructive in the way we see the thinking develop today and through the libertarian, and I don't say all libertarians are like Charles Koch. I don't say all Republicans are like Charles Koch, but the thinking, the organized thinking around this goes back, I think, to, at least in our memory, to Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Prince George's County, Virginia. An unbelievable situation developed there, basically under the guidance of Harry Byrd, who was actually basically the political leader, the political god figure of Virginia at that time. And they decided they were not going to comply with Brown versus Board of Education and desegregate their schools. Tell me what happened. What did they do?
Yes, I'm very glad that you raised this, Don, because this is actually how I got into this research and where I picked up the thread of this story. And that was with the state of Virginia's policy. They led the South actually in this policy that Harry Byrd called massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education. And so there were a number of pieces of legislation that were folded into massive resistance, but the most important of which was tuition grants, so that white parents could pull their children out of schools that were going to desegregate and send them to private segregation academies. So these were, sort of the grandfathers of what we today call school vouchers. And that's where I picked up the story. Another piece of the massive resistance legislation required the state government to shut down any local school district that was about to desegregate. So this is an early example of what today many progressives in urban areas are faced with: preemption, where state legislatures use their power to deny local governments the right to do things, to have autonomy in their public affairs. So, and another part was to basically take away all First Amendment rights from the NAACP. So this was a package of legislation that was absolutely devastating to the Brown decision and to Black children and families in the region. What I found out in my research is that these free market economists that we all talk about as coming up only in the 1970s actually got involved in the events in Virginia. So Milton Friedman, famous for his book Capitalism and Freedom, actually issued a manifesto supporting these tax-funded school vouchers in 1955, knowing how it would be used by the massive resistors. And another figure that I ended up focusing a lot on in Democracy in Chains, a man named James McGill Buchanan, who had just come to Virginia, to Charlottesville to chair the economics department at UVA, he also got involved in defending these vouchers using economic theory rather than racial justifications or Calhounian constitutionalism. But so in other words, what happened there was a really interesting and formative, and I would say, you know, kind of a watershed marriage of Southern white segregationists and these Northern intellectual free market economists and their business backers.
So he's not a fly-by-night guy. He wins the Nobel Prize in economy. And he was able to make sense, economic sense of the positions that he was taking about choice, about free market economies, about minority representation, casting himself and his like as the minority in the republic. So my question then is, how did James McGill Buchanan become associated with the libertarian thinking and the developing philosophy of Charles and David Koch?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story that took me some time to piece together, but Buchanan himself was an interesting figure. He had come from an agrarian family in Tennessee, so very hard hit by the Depression. He understood, and he was part of this free market project from the time he was a grad student at University of Chicago in the late 1940s. But as a Southerner, and a Southerner from a farm background, no less, he understood that this cause would never win people over just by saying, hey, markets are great, you know, break down government and go to the market. He knew better than that. You know, he saw what the New Deal had done for the South in terms of raising it from abject poverty and providing for people's needs. So he had the really, I don't know, almost sinister shrewdness to understand that what was necessary was to undermine popular faith in government, to make people believe that, okay, the market has problems, but government can't fix your problems. And his way of doing that was trying to say that all public actors were just like market actors, only concerned with their own self-interest. And that is a very toxic notion that's now widespread in our culture. You know, I believe it contributed hugely to Donald Trump's victory and many other things that we've seen. But the long and the short of it is, he didn't just come up with these ideas to discredit government. He studied how to shift the rules step by step by step to undermine government, to make it so it cannot represent the people, up to including constitutional change. So he and Charles Koch got to know each other at least as early as 1969 in reaction to the campus unrest of the 1960s. But then James Buchanan worked with Charles Koch as Koch was developing this whole libertarian apparatus in the 1970s and beyond. And, you know, for people who have not had a chance yet to dig into this, it's really important to know that when we talk about the Koch network, we're talking about literally hundreds of organizations, right? From the Federalist Society to Americans for Prosperity to the American Legislative Exchange Council. We're talking about the State Policy Network that has groups in around states around the country, including in Minnesota, the Freedom Foundation of Minnesota, the Center of the American Experiment, and a couple of others. And they also have mobilization groups of different kinds for veterans, for Latinos, for for young people, et cetera. So it's a really elaborate apparatus. And what this apparatus is doing is acting on ideas that Charles Koch got from James Buchanan for how to essentially, and I'm not exaggerating here, and I'm a historian, roll back the 20th century worth of public policy and then lock it in with constitutional change. So this is really serious, high stakes stuff. And to grasp the importance of Buchanan's ideas, another way to look at it might be to look at Charles Koch. Everything he did was he was into this libertarian stuff, you know, from the 60s forward, these extreme property rights for wealthy individuals and corporations, but couldn't get anywhere. The ideas weren't popular. People weren't buying into them. Hardly anybody voted for the Libertarian Party his brother ran for in 1980. What he got from Buchanan was in effect a toolkit, a framework, a strategy for rigging the rules of government that has brought us to the point we're at today. So very, very significant, this coming together of a set of ideas and a huge, almost bottomless checkbook from Charles Koch, who is one of the richest men in the world, and also has assembled a network of hundreds of other donors.
So they want to roll back all of the governmental protections that are currently in place that would help those people who rely on and need government. But that includes me. I'm retired, so I'm on Social Security.
Yeah.
But they would privatize that and put that at risk in the market. Medicare, Medicaid, they would roll that back or privatize it. They would put it in the hands of the rich of this nation. I don't want to castigate rich people. I just want to say that this is part of the stealth effort, that and also the effort to actually change the Constitution, which may not be far off, because even though it takes a lot of states to vote for a constitutional amendment, they've put a lot of people in Supreme Court seats. So with the help of the Heritage Foundation, with the help of the of Majority Leader McConnell, then Majority Leader McConnell, we have now people on the Supreme Court who are primed to do the kind of work that Charles Koch once done to change the democracy, as we call the democracy, change the republic, change the rules of the road. How are they doing that?
Yeah. Well, they were doing that in a couple of ways. Since the 1970s, Charles Koch has been working on trying to change our ultimate rule book, the Constitution, right, and the legal system. So from the 1970s forward, he was investing in groups to promote litigation, you know, to take to court cases, to promote these arch visions of property rights, to litigate for school vouchers, against regulations, et cetera. Also, he provided seed money for the Federalist Society, which is behind the seating of all of those judges on the conservative Supreme Court supermajority that we have now, 6-3. And they also work to get the nominations to secure the seats of Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett under Donald Trump. So they have put all of this in place, but the ultimate game, the ultimate long game strategy is actually to change the US Constitution. At the first ever Constitutional Convention since 1787, when the Constitution was created. This is something they've been doing quietly, kind of, you know, out of the main public view, but they've been at it for some years now, having really started pushing in earnest in 2013 through, again, the American Legislative Exchange Council that Representative Moran was talking about. And there are now 28 states of the 34 needed that have authorizations for a constitutional convention on the books. So you need 34 states to convene such a convention. If you have that, they gloat that Congress won't be able to do anything, the president won't be able to do anything, they will have it. So 6 more states. And I want to say too, Thank you to Minnesota, because your mobilization, your seriousness, your commitment of the activists in the 2018 midterms, when you won back one of your state houses, you didn't know it, but you were one of the states they were going to go to. So this constitutional convention effort is incredibly serious, needs much more attention. Common Cause has been very much on top of this. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to their website. You could Google Article 5 Constitutional Convention and you'll get information. Also, the Center for Media and Democracy, which is fantastic about tracking the Koch network, ALEC, and others. They have also done significant reporting about this Constitutional Convention, but it is really a serious effort. Common Cause has called it the most serious threat to democracy, proceeding almost beneath the radar. And one of the leaders of this effort, a Tea Party leader named Mark Meckler, said on the radio that their goal is to reverse 100 years of legislation. They want to go back, no, not just the civil rights movement, not just the New Deal. They want to go back and reverse progressive era legislation and constitutional amendments, enabling things like the income tax and the direct election of US senators. So this is so radical. It is so far from conservative. It is, and that's another thing I think maybe is important for us to pick up on. We are shadowboxing if we think we're just talking now about Democrats and Republicans or conservatives and liberals. These people are not conservatives. They are radical right libertarians. In the 1970s, they were honest about that. Now they fly under a false flag, but they are taking direct aim at 100 years of public policy that was brought into being by citizen mobilizations, from the labor movement to the civil rights movement, to the environmental movement, to the senior citizens who won Social Security. All of these things would be at risk if this cause succeeds.
It was the most chilling part of your book, I think, Professor, of thousands of chilling lines that you were able to unearth in your investigation, in your exposition. But that the Articles of Confederation said it can be done. The Constitution says it can be done, Article 5, that they do have a pathway to changing this country against the will of the majority.
Yes, and that to me, in my view, that is the most significant finding of my book. Is, because there are other people who have followed the money trail. There are people who have looked at, the transformation of the Republican Party. But when you look at this trail of ideas that comes out of Virginia in the 1950s and goes up to the Koch network now, when you focus on that aspect of it, you see that they are determined to win and secure tiny minority rule over the majority. That is what this is all about. And so what was so interesting to me in the research was to see them saying that over and over again in their own words, realizing that their ideas are unpopular, so they have to go at it a different way. Charles Koch in 1997, when he was really beginning to push for all this in earnest, he said to a gathering of grantees, of people who received funding from him, he said, "Since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure." So what he's getting at there is they know they're outnumbered. They'll never win if they put out what they're really seeking honestly, openly, so it can be debated and refuted. They'll lose. But this technology, and he's an engineer with 3 engineering degrees from MIT, this technology that they're talking about, the technology would enable them to prevail despite the fact that they are a minority. So they are very skillfully exploiting some existing rules in the American Constitution, such as, the fact that every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population. So a vote, someone who's in Wyoming has a vote that has 440 times more weight than California's, right? And we are currently, the majority is already being ruled by minority in the Senate. So they are taking advantage of all kinds of things like that. The Senate, the filibuster, the electoral college, all of these anti-majoritarian devices that are already there. But to those, they are adding things like the destruction of labor unions, as Scott Walker tried to do with the attack on public sector collective bargaining rights, with the gerrymandering to radically misrepresent the electorate, just like in Harry Bird's Virginia, they did it, and with the voter suppression measures that came out, just a slew of them in 2011 and then 2013, and now we're seeing a whole new group of these voter suppression measures after the majority won in Georgia, and we got two great new U.S. senators from Georgia. So these efforts to restrict democracy are core to this project, as is constant, consistent disinformation, whether it was tobacco in the 1980s, climate from the as Attorney General Ellison was saying, climate denial, cynical climate denial from the late 1970s forward, or the myth of voter fraud, constantly relying on disinformation to achieve their ends. And also, and I think this is really important to where we started with John C. Calhoun, weaponizing racism and deliberately exacerbating all kinds of prejudices, whether it's against African Americans with the myth of voter fraud, whether it's the attacks on immigrants to get Republican voters that they've agitated for years through Fox News and so forth to the polls, or attacks on women and their reproductive rights. All of these things are designed to get votes for an agenda that otherwise would not be popular.
Professor, I wish I had 2 hours to sit and talk with you about all of these things. I've done my part in this little interview in trying to elucidate some of the theses that you have put in Democracy in Chains. But what I need to do is invite in Sam Grant, who is the executive director of MN 350, and Representative Emma Greenman, because they have experience on the ground. I have the 30,000 foot level of a journalist looking at all of this stuff and trying to piece it together, but they have their specific stories about the effect of ALEC, another Koch-inspired organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where bills that are appearing throughout state houses in all over the United States are identical to the playbook that comes out of the Koch enterprises. So I'm going to turn you over to them. I may moderate from time to time, but let me introduce you to Sam Grant and to someone you know and have worked with, Representative Emma Greenman. Go ahead, you guys.
Emma, since you and Nancy are great friends, I yield to you to begin the dialogue.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I before I was in the Minnesota House and got to see some of this firsthand, I spent 5 years working with states across the country on all the ways that people participate in voting rights and the role that money in politics play, redistricting. And one of the things that I think I have noticed since, as a voting rights lawyer who felt like 10 years ago, I've sort of felt in the wilderness when I would talk about this. I think that there has been the public consciousness is really raised. But one thing I'd love to sort of hear you talk about a little bit, Nancy, and that I really appreciated about your book was, I think we think about voter ID, and in Minnesota, we have some experience with that and fighting that battle. We think about Citizens United over there. We think about criminalizing protest and sort of how that came about and thinking about Black Lives Matter. And then we think about attacks on unions and all these other things. And I think a lot of times, and I, as a voting rights lawyer, we've thought about them separately as sort of different lanes, and we've all been in our silos. And one of the things about your book that was really compelling to me a couple of years ago when you wrote it was really how this all exists as a system to divide us, but how our silos are actually making it harder for us to see those connections. And I'd love to ask you sort of how that fits into your analysis as you look at 2020 and 2021 and the work we have to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. And I remember when we first met, one of the things you said that really stayed with me is you said that they have us playing whack-a-mole. They attack unions over here and environment there and civil rights here and women there. And we think that these things are separate and they're coming from separate groups of people who have different motivations. And granted, the rank and file, are different people and they, may buy into one piece of this and not another. But for the strategists behind this and the funders who are supporting all these organizations, who are coordinating their efforts, who make a real effort to shift the leaders from one group to another so they see all the operations, this is an integrated operation. All of it goes together. And so perversely, I think, though, that they have given us a kind of gift on the progressive side, because, you know, people have used the expression, you know, like, you know, herding frogs in a wheelbarrow, and, you know, it's just so hard to pull us together, right? But even though, you know, our values bring us together in terms of fairness, you know, justice, transparency, you know, sustainability, compassion, there are so many things that bring us together. But as you say, for years, progressives have been in different silos, cut off from one another. And you also pointed out, when we talked, you know, way back then, that foundations have been a part of this problem, right? That foundations have put groups in competition who should be working together, who should be a phalanx to be defending Social Security, defending, you know, environmental legislation, voting rights, et cetera. But instead, they're put into a competitive relationship. So there's lots of dynamics to this. But I think that once we do see what's going on and we realize how coordinated all of this is from the other side, and really, you know, if you don't believe this, just go to the website of Center for Media and Democracy or True North or DeSmog blog. You'll be stunned at how much the funders are driving all of these different things on so many fronts. Once we see that, I think we begin to realize something absolutely crucial that goes back to Representative Moran's comments in opening tonight's conversation, and that is that we all depend on democracy. For years, we didn't think about it. You know, we just took it for granted. Well, it's there, you know, like if we persuade the majority and we move this stuff and we, you know, demonstrate in the streets and get attention on these issues, well, surely we'll win because they make sense and they represent the common good. Well, what the political right is doing is taking away that toolkit. The thing that we all depend on, whether it's, you know, for whatever issue, whatever silo, we need to have a working, transparent democracy accountable to the people. And in taking that away, the bright side of all that I've talked about, I think is, and I think more and more people are realizing this, we are in this together. Right. And you're like, you know, I know Annie Leonard at Greenpeace, the head of Greenpeace, has said, we realize we're not going to get a clean environment, a healthy environment, unless we have a healthy democracy. You know, over at Planned Parenthood, they're saying we're realizing we can't defend women's health unless we have a healthy democracy. You know, and you could go on and on from there, but I think it goes back to that core point you made years ago, Emma, is that we have to stop thinking of this in terms of whack-a-mole and start seeing the big picture before us. And instead of going from defense on all these individual battles, to go on offense and help the public understand what's happening here.
Sam, what do you see on the ground from your perspective, not only being on campus where Koch has made great inroads? In fact, campus organizations have popped up all across the country to get rid of Koch influence in academia, but also as the executive director of MN350. Do you see the effect of this money? Do you see the effect of all of these AstroTurf organizations having, they sound like, as Nancy says, they're coming from 1,000 different sources. So it makes you want to pay attention to a lot of different voices until you realize that the puppeteer is Charles Koch, and they're all mouthing his words.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Don. We are in very perilous times. Minnesota is highly respected as a very progressive state. And yet, as Nancy points out in her book, and as Stephanie points out in one of her comments in the chat, we have created a political system where minority rule is the norm. So Minnesota has a majority of senators who are climate deniers. And having a majority of senators who are climate deniers during the Trump administration allowed for a massive unraveling of protections for the environment. And that made our work a lot harder. And so after 4+ years of draining environmental regulation, and still coming out of a really hard fight. Thank goodness for Georgia's great work to flip things on the national level. We worked hard to get a climate majority here in Minnesota. And I want to be clear. I don't care what your political party is. What I care about is that regardless of your political persuasion, you understand, respect, and follow the science and support the deepening of democracy as opposed to the draining of democracy. So Nancy, you mentioned that among the weapons of the radical libertarian right is weaponizing racism. And one of the things we're seeing on the ground is the way in which our governor, who is considered a great liberal himself, allowed the Line 3 pipeline to come through Minnesota. And that has caused significant devastation of the landscape in northern Minnesota and is a direct violation of treaty rights. And as we make the argument that it's in the benefit of all Minnesotans to honor treaty rights, I can only imagine that radical libertarians would just laugh that concept off the stage and consider it a non-starter. And so I want to go back to 1957 when Exxon was, truth be told, called Humble Oil. And Humble Oil had a scientist who put together a report that said, climate change is human caused, and we are a significant contributor to it, and we need to begin to think about how we're going to take responsibility for it. And by 1988, when James Hansen spoke to Congress and said, we are in danger and we have to correct our pattern of society right now, otherwise things are going to unravel in a way that facilitates runaway feedback loops in the climate system. In 1988, we were at 350 parts per million. That's the name of my organization. We need to get back to where we are in 1988. Right now, we're at 419.22 parts per million as of yesterday, when I last looked at the number. So given the devastating critique and analysis of the pattern that's unfolded, I'd love to hear from you what you think the steps are for those of us who care about democracy and want to deepen democracy to take it back. So what are some of the operational mechanisms we can utilize to make sure that this constitutional convention tribe has no chance of getting from 28 to 34?
Yeah, the all important question, hard to answer quickly. Just to underscore something you said, Sam, and help participants, attendees of this event understand how serious the kind of coup of consciousness and of power has been on this issue. I point out in the book that in the early 1990s, there was no difference between the two parties on the science of climate, it was then called global warming. Today we call it more broadly climate change, but there was no difference on the science then. On the policy, definitely, but not on the science. By 2014, only 8 of 278 Republicans in Congress would admit that climate change was human caused and needed action. That, and the Koch network brags about that. They call it the accountability play. They say that's our secret sauce. So what they have effectively done is kind of taken over one of our major political parties through this pincers action of huge funding from the donors that rewards the compliant. And by the way, they funded all 13 US senators who didn't want to acknowledge that Biden had won the election. So they fund and support those who comply with them, and they fund primary challenges and activate that party base against anybody who doesn't toe the line. So we're in a really serious problem now in Congress, because as people are seeing, the Republican Party is not responsive to its own voters. And I think President Biden has been very smart in saying his policies are bipartisan. If you look at voter support, voters, there's lots of voter support for all of these measures, whether it's for the People Act or the Rescue Act or Jobs Plan, but the elected officials are not supporting that. So what we need to do in many different ways is change the landscape. So, Emma Greenman has long been involved in, as she said, voting rights work and in democracy reform. So the For the People Act that is up in Congress and will probably come up this summer is hugely important. If we don't win that, it potentially could be game over. So this is crucial. And again, the filibuster, there was a question in the chat about the filibuster. We have got to take on the filibuster to make sure we can get democracy reform, to protect voting rights, transparency, stop the gerrymandering, etc. So there are reforms that we can make. But I think, as you also suggested, Sam, in your comments, we've got to find ways to help people see that what these folks are doing is not in their interest, right? And so, for example, there are good organizations that are doing rural organizing and reaching out to rural voters who have similar concerns about the quality of their healthcare, their access to healthcare, their education, and things like water. Between deregulation, fracking, et cetera, many rural communities are finding that their water supplies are really contaminated, and they're in deep trouble there. So we've got to have people, out there on the ground reaching people about the issues that they care about. And then I think we also have to think about how to kind of split up this phalanx on the other side. For years, they practiced what they called wedge politics, against progressives, whether it was abortion or, busing or things like that, to try to divide folks on the progressive side. But I think that, for example, in the issues you're dealing with climate change, how do we reach people in all the industries that will be harmed that are already being harmed by what's happening with extreme weather coming from climate change? So the farmers who are facing droughts and floods, whose crops are threatened, the tourism industries that are being devastated in coastal areas, the insurance industry that is having to do all these payouts for this catastrophic weather. There have got to be ways of getting parts of corporate America to understand that they shouldn't be throwing down with the American Legislative Exchange Council and the Koch donor network. So that would be one thing. I think also we need to reach out to faith communities. There are many good people of faith in this country who are there because they have, values and family traditions and such, and they don't realize that this libertarian political project has an ethical system. But it's an ethical system that is at odds with the best of every major religious tradition in the world, all of which say we have to care for the poor, we have to welcome the stranger, we have to provide for the sick. Those traditions of compassion are part of every major religious tradition. And libertarianism, if it's anything, is anti-compassion and anti-human solidarity. So I do think that once we become aware of what we're dealing with here and realize that it's not one another and that they benefit when we're yelling at one another, I think we can really start to think creatively about how to come to terms with. And I think that's really something that we've seen a lot of, ironically, since 2016. I think Donald Trump's election was a huge wake-up call to a lot of folks who hadn't been paying attention. And there's a lot of really good alliance building and thinking going on today. So I am actually encouraged at what we've been seeing, even as the threats are really dire.
Professor, before we go back to Representative Greenman, as a journalist, I've seen over the past 50 years that manipulation of the electorate is a fine art, that it has been practiced and it has been honed and is well underway. Manipulation, whether it was Donald Trump or whether it was Barry Goldwater or whoever, even Ronald Reagan, manipulation of the electorate. The telling of truth that you did, I think you used the word, if we can just become aware. The way I think of that is that if people knew the truth, do you think that that would have an effect on breaking the hold that the Virginia School of Economics and the Koch brothers have over the Republican base?
Yeah, really crucial question. Another crucial question. I don't actually know that they have a hold over the Republican base. And I think they're feeling that too. They have a hold over those elected officials who would do anything before they'd let themselves get voted out of office by this cause. Like the idea that they're facing such threats from Donald Trump that they can't speak up. Look at, Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib. They're facing death threats from this cause all the time, and yet they continue to speak out. So I think more courage could be in order all around. But I think as far as the manipulation of the electorate goes, I think it's going to be a challenge to break through, quite honestly, because the echo chamber is so profound. There's media studies that show that Fox viewers and Breitbart, that those folks are actually in their own media universe that is not part of a broader, center right to left spectrum where people read all kinds of different things, evaluate them, et cetera. In that milieu, it's really about identity. It's about this embattled white nationalist, evangelical, religious identity. And Fox News constantly cultivates that and pokes it and gets people so that they're in like a stress response where they just want to be aggressive because they've been told they're under attack. That's going to be a challenge to break through. But I teach the history of social movements. And so from that, I also get a sense that, organizing often works in concentric circles. You start where you are, you expand that group, you move beyond. So I think, if everyone on this call said, I'm gonna learn about this and I'm gonna find ways to alert others and be active, and each of us, reached out to 5 people who we think might agree but aren't active now, that would make a huge difference. And in time, we would bump into those Fox viewers, and the others and find ways to break through. But I think right now in the immediate term, the crucial thing is really to alert, the people who, if they knew about this, they'd be outraged and they'd be active. And then when you get enough of them, it's like the civil rights movement, you start to change the larger, national consciousness.
Let me go to Representative Greenman, and I have a question for you, Representative, and maybe that can be folded into a discussion with the professor. The question that I have for you is, what is your experience in watching the American Legislative Exchange Council at work in Minnesota? Mm-hmm. And what kind of threat do you think it poses? And you can ask any question then of the professor that might fit.
Yeah, so I think that anybody, so I saw this both when I was doing policy around the country, right? Like the end here in Minnesota. And I think the telltale sign is it is centralized crafted policy that is handed and given. So when we look at voter ID, when we look at the criminalization of protests that we've seen, and the list goes on and on and on. And I've only been in the legislature one session, but we see the fingerprints. And what I think is really important, because I think it is important to how we respond, is this individual versus collective. But the way that we defend and strengthen our democracy is actually believing in people and believing in the power of people collectively. And I think that that is really important, because I have sat through, the last couple of months, we have had amazing hearings on paid family leave, on or earn sick and safe, and those are just the committees that I've seen. And 70% of Minnesotans, and I think it tracks America, believe in paid family leave. These are not radical ideas. They're actually quite popular. And over and over and over again, we have, tens of people in each hearing who come in and tell their stories. And Republican lawmakers sit there, they listen. Sometimes they ask questions. They tell a story about how it's either a regulatory issue or it's just, it's the cities trying to push an agenda, but they are not listening to or really in relationship with the best, the what is popular in their district. And what I think is really important is that we are fighting for that idea that we all do better when we all do better, right? We're here in Minnesota, and I got my start as an organizer on Paul Wellstone's campaign, but that the way we all do better when we all do better is by collective power, whether that's voting, whether that's in a union, whether that's organizing through issue advocacy. And what you see in the legislature right now is this sort of, and I will say this is, I know that in the chat there was some comments about the media, but there is this infatuation with bipartisanship, and on the issues that I work on democracy issues, I say they're not bipartisan, they're nonpartisan, right? They are about ensuring that every person, no matter where they live, what their political party is, what background they are, has a piece of this conversation, and that we believe that government is the place we're going to come together and make decisions together. And so the ALEC model or the sort of very centralized ALEC or PIL for Heritage Action, sort of, there's all of these different interests and playing in, but they are not about communities solving problem together, not even a conservative bent of communities solving problem together. We should disagree. That's what government is about, right? There are lots of different people with lots of different opinions, but that's actually not what these ALEC bills are about. That's not what Republicans coming in with that attitude are. They are actually about a top-down model that is both anti-democratic and also not the best way to do things. But I do think it's on us to say, not just to expose what they're doing, but to actually say, what does it mean to reject what I think Nancy wrote about in her book, which is a style that says, you're on your own, greed is king, don't trust your government, your union, your immigrant neighbor. And that is what we're fighting for. And all of the, I am fighting very hard for great, money in politics rules and really important expanding voter access and all of those things. But if we don't actually take on that more fundamental crux, that is, we collectively should govern together. And I think you said it, Don, the majority that are actually our government is, and our democracy is, that majorities matter. We're going to be in this space where we're going to be playing whack-a-mole and fighting the fight. And I think that's the question I have for you, Nancy, is, again, like, we haven't talked for probably since the insurrection, but thinking about the insurrection and that there are now all folks who are seeing the big lie for what it is. Yeah. One, do you feel like that's shifted? Has that shifted this conversation? Is there an opening to say, we're going to talk about a democracy that is rooted in truth and people? Or do you feel, is there hope?
Yeah, I do think there's a huge opening. And I think even, President Biden, as a friend of mine says, he's outperforming expectations. But, he really does seem to get that this is a historic moment, that democracy is on trial now. And the question is, will democracy deliver for people in the way that Emma was describing, where we all do better when we all do better? And that hasn't happened for a long time. Democrats lost the South in terms of state races, not after the Civil Rights Act. There's a kind of a narrative about that I had been part of myself. That was at the presidential level, but at the state level, Democrats really lost the South after NAFTA. When all of those jobs left, all those manufacturing jobs, a lot of desperation. So I do think Biden really, really gets that we have to do better so that all of us are doing better, so that we have less, hostility and rancor in our society as well, and we can address these long-term challenges. And I think Biden has that understanding because progressives have mobilized around the country in so many different ways, including, the group that you worked with, Emma, before you were in the legislature, the Center for Popular Democracy, Indivisible, the Women's March, the unions. Everybody has been really, really working hard, I think, since 2016 to lift up these core issues about how democracy works and the need to make democracy responsive. So I am encouraged by that, and I do think it is a major opening. And I'm actually on this other list too, where I see progressive groups mobilizing, to move the conversations that need to happen and stuff. So I think there's a much more coordination than there used to be, and much more kind of singing from the same hymnal, like realizing again that that if we don't have a functioning democracy, we're it's all over. So all of that is good, but as you said, it's also you know, we're in a situation where we have a party that's now seeming to deny that there even was an insurrection. You know, who was it from Georgia? I forget his name, but who said, oh no, it was just like tourists coming through the Congress. You know, I mean, this is unthinkable that is happening. So it means that the citizenry has to be really alert and engaged, and we have to find ways to do that. One thing, there's been, you know, some interesting comments in the chat too about how do we alert people to this. One thing is accountability. And I think we have to realize that, I'm sure those of you, you know, who are in the legislature understand this full well, that with the crisis of journalism in this country and the falling out of the kind of business model of the journalism that sustained the democracy, you know, for generations, now it's like a tree falling in the forest and no one hears. So there's very, very little attention paid to what goes on in state government. And so, as Emma was saying, these Republican elected officials are acting at odds with even the desires of their own voters, but the voters seem not to know that. So accountability is a crucial thing, and there are good folks who are working on that. I know someone who's doing that accountability work in different states. She was saying even like in Alaska, they had where they were being taken over by, you know, this radicalized kind of Koch republicanism. They started a Facebook site, I think, that was called like Save Our State or something, and just started alerting people to what these legislators were doing and who was supporting them and where the outside money was coming from, and that the legislation, you know, the templates for the laws are coming from outside. And it really helped, you know, and so there have been some real victories with that accountability work. So I think a crucial step going forward, and a reason why it's so great there's so many Minnesota groups involved in tonight's event, is that state politics are kind of where it's at now, right? Like, there are people paying attention to federal, you know, to the national politics, and there's lots of people who are active in local politics, but the place that progressives really let slide to all of our detriment was state level politics. And we're realizing now, if you control the states, you can control almost everything, right? You know, the voting legislation, the healthcare, everything else. So I think, you know, another takeaway from tonight's discussion would be finding ways to get more good people to follow what's going on in their state houses and in their gubernatorial mansions and get active on that.
Sam, before I come to you to wrap it up with your final question, I wanted to throw a cherry bomb into this conversation. Professor, it seems to me that there is a through line all the way from John C. Calhoun to the current 46 states working on voter suppression laws, and that's white supremacy. It seems like the underlying thing, the thread that ties all of this together, is a distaste for the takers, a distaste for anyone who would reach into a rich man or woman's pocket and take out tax money and spend it to benefit those people. That seems like these rules of voter ID and suppression and the shouts of fraud is no different than a poll tax or a literacy test. It seems like they're exactly the same to me. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong in the broad outlines of this this incredibly privileged, entitled minority that imagines themselves victims. So John C. Calhoun, he complained about the takers in his day. Now he couldn't racialize it like they do now, because the people of color were in chains, you know, working for him, and he was trying to maintain, you know, his power to do whatever he wanted to that workforce. So who Calhoun was afraid of was the yeoman of the country, the small farmers or small planters who wanted things like good roads to get their goods to market because they couldn't be near the seaside. They wanted schools for their children. They wanted things like that. And Calhoun talked about them as he didn't use the language of takers. It's in the book, but he talked about them as being kind of like the parasites trying to get, infringe on the liberty of the property. So I think this is a language. We can't do an either or. I don't think it's just race. I don't think it's just class. I think because of the history of slavery in our country and the fact that we developed, what scholars now call racial capitalism with the first slavery and then the way that the whole system developed thereafter, these things have always been fused together. And you can't really, it's almost like you have to kind of balance them to kind of get the mix right, as I think Dr. King, talked about a great deal in his last years. But I did see that somebody in the chat mentioned the work of Ian Haney Lopez, who has a book. What is it called?
Dog Whistle Politics.
Yeah, Dog Whistle Politics, and then he has another one called Merge Left, I think it is. And he did a lot of work with Demos on this. So they actually poll tested these messages, and they found that they did this poll testing with Black, white, Latino, Asian vote, like a broad group of voters. What they found is that if you only talked about the class dimension of what this right is doing to us, you got maybe to hear. If you only talked about the race dimension, you got maybe to hear, or with some people even, you got less far along. But if you helped people understand that they are using racial division to hurt all of us, right, and to move their agenda, that's when you really made a significant difference, including with white voters. Like, they got it in a way that they didn't get it, with a class alone message or a message that was only about racism. So I think, learning to, on our side, kind of chew gum and walk, right, to address all of these things at the same time is really helpful. And I would recommend to people too, he has 2 really good books for people who like to read whole books, but Demos, the think tank, if you go onto their website, and I think it's called Race Class Fusion, but they have a summary of that research, and they even have language, like language that doesn't help and language that does help. And I think once people start to think about, how do we really frame these issues so that people can understand that, we need each other. As Emma said, we do better when we all do better when we all do better, and that there are people who are turning us against one another in order to ensure that we can't do better. So that was a long-winded answer. Yes, white supremacy is absolutely central, and we need to take it on. But I think we need to find ways of doing so that bring people into the conversation and help them see their stake in it, even if they don't feel directly affected personally.
Sam, take us home, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Don. I want to go back to the part of the question that you asked when I began to speak that I didn't get to answering, and that was to talk about the academy. Nancy mentioned racialized capitalism, and there's a colleague of ours, Gargi Bhattacharya, who wrote a great book on rethinking racial capitalism that came out in 2019. And she recently was removed from her position as a professor in the UK, because my understanding from a good colleague of mine who is finishing his doctoral dissertation in the UK is that they have actually made it state policy that you can't talk about capitalism in the classroom. A couple of days ago, after hearing this from my colleague, I was in a coffee shop with a good friend of mine who teaches at the University of Minnesota, and I told him this news, and I said, we don't have stuff like that happening here, do we? And he said, actually, we do. During the Trump administration, there was active attacks on using critical race theory in the classroom. So there is a block to the conversation that we want to bring forward, particularly those of us in BIPOC bodies. And Don, you talked about white supremacy. If we use that language of white supremacy, obviously it's an automatic close off to conversation as opposed to an opening to conversation. So I'm thinking about 3 simple rules that we need to live by as we think about going forward from here. One is the concept that Kimberly Crenshaw Williams has popularized, intersectionality. I think that we need to think beyond the oppression Olympics of saying it's about racism, it's about gender oppression, it's about border violence, it's about xenophobia, it's about heteropatriarchy, it's about all of these things in relationship to each other. It's about urban versus rural. We need to bring these issues together. And I think learning from the example of the marriage amendment, we need to do a constant relational evolutionary process of work. And we always need to be thinking through from the perspective of mutual benefit. How do we nurture mutual benefit in these conversations? I think about Minnesota, which has 100,000 lead service lines. If we and the Biden administration has put together a policy that is not likely to get passed by the Senate, to put $43 billion into cleaning up all the lead service lines in the country, that would probably bring enough money into Minnesota to completely replace all of those lead service lines, and that would have a significant benefit to both urban and rural Minnesotans. If we think about the ways in which we have been divided, my great friend, now ancestor, Kirk Washington Jr. said, we already know how to be divided. What I want to know is how can we really come together? And so my closing question for you, Nancy, is given that you're a historian, and you've done this most brilliant work on helping us understand the Koch revolution in America, what evidence can you point us to, thinking about all the questions in the chat right now, which are really, really great questions that I think are evidence of where we are at in our understanding of the complexity of this? Can you point us to moments in history when we had this extreme intractability and we came through it to the other side? And then based on how different this moment is from past moments, and picking up on the thread that Don raised, white supremacy, white nationalism, evangelicalism, market fundamentalism are all still here in this stew. Given the complexity of that in this moment, how do we actually think about and address all of these things as a collective set in a way that we haven't yet? Yeah. Right? Because I think there are problems that we haven't solved. And I think in the chat, somebody talks really clearly, more than one person. The Republicans have a coherent message based on fear. And you talked about the stress response, which I think is really, really brilliant as a way to think about it. The Democrats are all over the map with all of these issues. How can we actually have a coherent strategy that replaces and transcends this really terrible pattern that moves us towards fascism?
Yeah. Wow. So really crucial questions. One thing I would say on the messaging, I'm also part of another effort that I'd encourage people to check out called The Bold Rethink, that is trying to re-message on these narratives and to cut against all the kind of anti-government propaganda from years and help people understand democracy in the ways that we need to. So, and there is a website, The Bold Rethink, so that might be a place to look. Another thing that you gestured to all the amazing commentary in the questions and the Q&A. I know there's going to be a follow-up event for this, so I hope there will be a chance to get at that. And I would love to just have us all sent that, the stuff that's in the chat, because it's just so rich and there's so much to think about. But on the critical historical question that you raised, Sam, which is so important, because if we don't have history, if we don't have something to go back to, we're kind of lost in a moment like this, which is why I like being a historian. I would say that we have absolutely had moments like this before in our history, and two of the most dramatic were the Civil War, the run up to the Civil War, and then the Great Depression and the New Deal. And in both of those eras, I think it's also instructive that you had these extreme property supremacists who really created these problems with the, what the brilliant African-American historian John Hope Franklin called the militant South. All those people who were inspired by John C. Calhoun, who were moving into, turning slavery into the most aggressive form of capitalism, throughout the new states of the Deep South and Southwest, who brought on the Civil War. That was one moment. And then the extreme capitalists in the 1920s who decimated workers' rights, regulation, et cetera, let the stock market run wild and brought us into a depression and then wanted to stop action on it. What got us out of those crises was the kind of process Emma Greenman was talking about, with politics becoming a collective thing, beginning with the abolitionists, enslaved African and African descended people who knew that they were humans, not property, who fought the slaveholders, inspired small numbers of Northern radicals to ally with them, and created this ferment that led ultimately to, a Republican Party that was a good Republican Party in the days of Lincoln. There was a Civil War, yes, but there were also coming out of that, the 13th, 14th, and particularly the 14th and 15th Amendment, laid the foundation for almost every reform that's come since then. So that was a crucial moment, but that popular majoritarian, pro-democratic mobilization kind of saved the republic, saved the country, and brought us out of this deep crisis. Similarly, in the Great Depression, the huge workers' mobilization, the mobilization by senior citizens for retirement security, African-American mobilization for, didn't win racial equity, but put it on the national agenda as never before in the Depression and World War II. That also saved us from that generation of extreme property supremacists. And again, it took major structural democratic reform to do it. The civil rights movement, I think, was not as fully didn't completely transform the whole government, but the same kinds of dynamics. So I think again and again we see that in a crisis like this, it's the citizen mobilization that will lead the way out, right? And we have been here before. It's, in some ways it's been much worse. If you look at the challenge the abolitionists faced in the 1830s, every single institution in this society was against what they were trying to do. We have huge resources on our side. Labor movement is in battle, but there's still strong unions. There's incredible, cultural work, intellectual work, organizations of all different kinds, but we've got to learn to move together, right? And as Emma Greenman was saying, break down those silos and start, rowing in the same direction. But I do have great confidence that it will be hard. It will require a lot from all of us, but it can be done. And I believe if we do it, then we could have a similar breakthrough in our time where we deal with the climate with planetary sustainability. And the only way to do that is to get a Green New Deal that builds a sustainable economy that says we all matter, that where we support the caring economy as well as road building and other things. And I think there are millions of people out there who really want that. And so we've got to figure out how to make it possible.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you to both our panelists. And I want to get to some of the questions that have come in. I want to start with Jeff Clark. Nancy, in this struggle toward an amendment that deals with the problems of money in politics and corporate rights, what do you see as the best way to counter the anti-democratic forces you've been talking about? Is it possible?
Yeah, I think it is. It has to be possible. We have to find ways to make it possible. For folks who may not know about that amendment, he's speaking about an amendment to deal with money in politics, which is the only way to really address it in a significant way because of the Citizens United decision that was pushed by the Koch network litigators that opened the spigots to money in politics and brought us to the mess of dark money we're in now. So there are groups like End Citizens United, Move to Amend, and others who are pushing for a constitutional amendment to address that. And frankly, I think some of the most important work in that effort is the popular education that goes on in pushing for the amendment, to show people what it means to have all this dark corporate money in politics that is, distorting our public agendas, promoting disinformation, et cetera. Another key place source to look at for that is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island is fantastic he has actually a book called Capture, the Corporate Infiltration of Democracy, and he's followed the courts issues. I would look to his work on this too. He's really good, but we've got to be, again, educating people and helping people to understand that all these terrible things didn't just happen. There are mechanisms and there are policies and there are court victories that have enabled all this, and we've got to push back against those.
Nancy, the next one comes from Oakley Smith. The answer seems to have a lot, if not all, to do with psychology and sociology, but so much of it seems to fly in the face of the classic economic assumption that by nature humans are rational and self-interested. Can you address that?
Yeah. So much neoclassical economics and the kind of free market fundamentalism is based on that idea that people are rational, self-seeking actors. And there's a huge domain of research that contradicts that, called behavioral economics, that shows that that is not, in fact, the case. And in fact, many of these Koch operations, and I've written about this elsewhere, but they actually, when they got this going, they talked about leveraging insights from evolutionary psychology cognitive psychology and evolutionary biology. And basically what they were getting at is this, what some people call the reptilian brain, this tribal brain, that if you could get people in that mode where they feel like they're part of a tribe that's being attacked by this other tribe, reason shuts down and you go to the body's fight flight kind of response. So they are really the more sophisticated among them are quite manipulative in that way, and I think much of their poll tested language relies on that. So I think I don't know exactly the best way to deal with that, but I think one way is to point it out when we see it, to point out the manipulative language that they're using. For example, they never say unions without saying union bosses, right? Or thugs, or language like that that's really like incendiary, or there's just so much language that they use that's coded in that way. Aliens, instead of undocumented immigrants and so forth. So I think we have to become conscious of that and address it. But I don't really have, I wish I had a magic formula for it, but I don't.
Professor, this is a question I think you'll appreciate because of your reliance on fact and on chasing evidence. This is a person, Charles Morris, who wants to know, is there a dynamic link chart available that depicts the linkages between the funders, the groups, and the various issues groups?
Yes, I actually saw that in the chat, and I wanted to remember to come back to that. I did produce such a chart from material that I had a couple of chapters that were cut from the book to keep it short, but I sort of extracted from those the model that the Koch network is using to shackle democracy, and so looked at the different steps and the organizations that are part of each step. It's a little bit outdated because they're always inventing new organizations, but I would be happy to share that with the hosts of tonight's event, who could then send it to people who have registered for this event. And maybe on the encouraging side too, I tried to think about what a progressive counter to that would be like, in some of the organizations that fall into the different areas like that. So yes, such a thing does exist. It may not be perfect, but it will give you a start, and we can put it out there and others can improve on it.
Here is just a brief list. So I'm going to say, if you hear these words associated with any message, your ears should curl. The Heritage Foundation, Citizens for a Sound Economy, Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works, the Club for Growth, the State Policy Network, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Tax Foundation, the Reason Foundation, the Leadership Institute. If you hear these, and included, because there's a heavy funding coming from Koch in the Federalist Society, if you hear these as sources of information, you know that it's coming from the Koch playbook. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really important that people understand who these groups are, and also be able to hold media accountable. For example, another Koch group is called Concerned Veterans for America. And it's really been alarming to me to hear national public radio have them on again and again without identifying where they're coming from. And this is important too, because they have pushed for things that put them at odds with every other veterans group in this country, including privatizing the Veterans Administration healthcare. So it's really important, as you're suggesting, Don, that people have a sense of who these groups are and be able to understand then where their message is coming from, but also raise the point with media that they need to be informing people about the sources they're turning to.
Final question. This one comes from Artie Dorman. Can someone address the degree to which Koch and company are using the notion of America as a Christian nation to advance their cause? We are increasingly a secular society, yet the reference to God-given rights always seems to carry the day.
Yeah, well, I can start with that, and then I'd love to hear from Emma and Sam about how you see this play out in Minnesota politics. But one thing I actually wish I had done more about in Democracy in Chains is the alliance between the Koch network and the religious right. It's really important, and there is no way that they could get the votes that they need to put these people in office without mobilizing the religious right. So they are supporters, for example, of this group called the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is waging a lot of the anti-abortion and homophobic litigation, including the Mississippi abortion bill that's now up in the Supreme Court. And to summarize what is actually a very broad alliance involving many groups, you can see this in the very person that Koch chose to head Americans for Prosperity, which they're now calling Stand Together to, but a guy named Tim Phillips, who worked with Ralph Reed in building up the Christian coalition and the religious right. So they are working with Christian nationalists. They'll work with anybody to get what they want, but it is extremely dangerous and incendiary, particularly, for Muslims, but also for people who are not religious, for liberal Catholics and Protestants and others. These people are extremely dogmatic and think that they have a monopoly on, what they understand as God, which seems to be very far from what Jesus talked about, for that matter. But anyway, yeah. So that's a hugely important nexus here, is the religious right and the working together with Christian nationalists.
We're going to wrap it up here, and there is going to be a follow-up on Thursday, June 3rd at 7 p.m. and there will be breakout sessions. It will be a Zoom meeting as well. I want to thank Sam Grant and Emma Greenman, and I want to thank you very much, Professor, for spending precious time. You are the most ubiquitous voice in the mainstream media today. Everybody wants a piece of you, and everybody wants a piece of the story and the investigations that you have done. And there is something that I have always relied on as a journalist, and it doesn't say, here, do it my way. It says, know this and proceed. And I think that's what you've done for us. We have to know what you have told us, and then we can proceed based on that information. So I want to thank you very much for that. And I hope you'll come back someday.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored, Don, and you were such a fabulous interviewer and moderator of this event. So thank you for your work and your years of exposing and investigating these issues. And thank you so much, Sam and Emma, for your work in the legislature, and also Representative Moran. We're all part of, I think of it now as a kind of cosmic division of labor. We can't all do everything. We're not all good at everything. We don't all care about every single piece of this, but if we can connect with one another, find the issues that we're passionate about, where we have the skills and the talent to bring, that we can, make a small dent in this, and know that we're going to be walking with great people who have good values. And actually, this work is a lot of fun, right? Like when you connect with people and you're part of that process of building a better society with people that you care about, getting results that you can see before your eyes, the transformation of people into leaders is just so exciting. And it has certainly sustained me, and I'm sure it sustains the other folks here who are part of this, and many of the people who are raising such informed questions and comments in the Q&A in the chat. So thank you all. It's really, really been a pleasure to be with you.
It's been our pleasure entirely. And so the message to everyone who has registered and listened to this program today, remember that June 3rd is the follow-up. And I wanted to say to you that basically there's a choice facing us, and it's coming at us very quickly, and that's whether you want an oligarchy of the rich, or as Louis Brandeis, the great jurist, once said, that you can have a concentration of wealth, or you can have a democracy, but you can't have both. So get active, and you can get active through MN 350, or you can consider being a part of Citizens Global Solutions, Clean Election Minnesota, Common Cause, Indivisible, MN 03, the Plymouth Area Indivisible, Minnesota Alliance for Peacemakers, Minnesota Peace Project, MN Move to Amend, the Spotlight Team, Women Against Military Madness, and Common Cause. Thank you very much for all standing up with us today for democracy. And we hope to see you at our next meeting, or we'll join you in your action. Thank you very much for joining us here on MN 350.
Thank you all.